Good morning. Welcome to Monday morning. Hope you're after a great one wherever you are. How are you doing this Monday as we start off a brand new week? It is the final day of February, believe it or not. We're going into the first day of March tomorrow. We'll just sort of orient ourselves for the week ahead. We have the State of the Union by the American President tomorrow night, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll give you a couple ways that you could watch that. That's going to be a critical address. It always is when we wait to hear from the President, whether it's a State of the Union or a joint address of Congress. But the timing of this really matters. Last week at this time, we were not dealing with a Russian attack of Ukraine. We heard that it could be coming, but it wasn't a reality. And that quickly changed towards the end of the week. We're in this period yet again where there's a lot of chaos, and we're realizing how fast stories can change. I was a little late jumping on this morning because I was continuing to check and try to chase some headlines here about what's actually happening. It's just after 10 o'clock Central Time in Texas, where I am. It's just after 6 o'clock in the evening in Ukraine. I'm going to shut my computer unless we need it. But I was checking some different threads from world leaders. And this is where social media actually helps. I know there's a lot of negatives to social media. One of the great things is that we're able to connect. One of the things I really appreciate about it is I have an instant newswire in a lot of ways to world leaders. You have to be very careful with the information that's coming out on social media right now. I know you're seeing a lot of viral videos. I've looked at a lot of them myself. There's been times I want to share them with you, but there's no way for me really to know from my vantage point with any great degree of confidence, where exactly this is happening, to make sure that the video actually happened today and not yesterday or last year. So we're in this period where there is a lot of chaos. I'm sure you're feeling that as well. I was feeling that dropping my kids off at school. And I sort of was thinking, wow, here we are in this, again, a great period of uncertainty. But in some ways, we're used to it, right? Yes, we have a different worry. We're concerned about the stakes of this war that's happening between Russia and Ukraine. And we're using all sorts of terms: conflict, attack, invasion. It's a war. This is a war that's happening in Eastern Europe. Yet we've had so much uncertainty over the last couple of years with the pandemic that none of us ever thought was ever going to be part of our lives, that in some ways we're I don't want to say we're used to it, but I don't know if you feel that way too, where you're suddenly, maybe we're emerging tougher than we thought in a lot of ways. I had some interesting questions from my children this weekend that I'd like to share with you. We'll get to that a little later on about this. I made a mistake last night. I really don't listen to television news at all. I don't know if you guys are watching a lot of television news. Do you have it on a lot, sort of in the background, because you're waiting and watching for breaking news? And let me just say this. There's a lot of great journalism being done. War correspondents, those that are in the middle of the conflict, that have the clarity and the on-the-scene perspective, amazing war photographers. This is a time that we can really appreciate some good journalism. It's also a time when you have a 24-hour news cycle that people are trying to fill. And when you have a lot of time that you're trying to fill, then you're going to have a lot of conversations that are drifting into hypothetical or situations that are having debates that may be not relevant to the specific headlines that can cause a lot of worry. And for the first time last night, because it's really the first time I had the television on for an extended period of time, I felt that. And so I'm not telling you to turn the television off. I'm saying that there's some good stuff and there's some bad stuff, and we just have to kind of wade through it together. The problem with news today is not a lack of information. It's a lack of organization and priority, and really making sure that the audience is taken care of. So one of the reasons I was getting some of the questions from my kids is that I did have the news on. And so despite what I do on a regular basis and they see me working, they're listening. They're listening all the time. Those kids are listening all the time. So let's start off first. What I decided to do is separate our report this morning because of the changing nature of events into three main things I think are really important to know as you start off your week. And then we'll take some of your questions and we'll go from there, and we'll see how good we do together, because it is a changing situation. Whatever I say now could drastically change in the next few hours, and we'll keep you updated best we can. But I think what we've isolated will add value regardless what point of the news cycle you kind of come back into. So first things first, and this actually ties to something that my 7-year-old asked me last night. Over the last 24 hours, this idea of a threat of a nuclear war has emerged. And the reason why is that? We know that Russian President Vladimir Putin was saying that he was responding to moves of the West to sort of activate or ready his nuclear forces, and paraphrasing there. That's enough to get anyone's attention and really cause a lot of fear. But the one thing I think you should know is that the risk of conflict, of nuclear conflict, is actually around us all the time. It's scary to think about that. We don't think about that very often. Because why? Because most of us live in the United States. We are the strongest military in the world, and we are protected in many ways from feeling the fear of invasion or threat because we do have the backing of the U.S. military. What I do want to show you is this, a map that shows us who has nuclear weapons and who doesn't. About 90% of the nuclear weapons on this planet are either in Russia or in the United States, according to the data that is available. And listen, we'll put an asterisk on it, but the data that's often used, and I know these numbers are really small, but I'm going to put a link to this map underneath this video on our website so you can take a closer look. Russia has more nuclear warheads than anywhere in the world, including the United States. So the stakes of a nuclear conflict is just important to know that that exists. It exists in the world. We're just seeing it in technicolor right now because we have a world leader mentioning it that actually has access to nuclear weapons. This is why so many of the stories that we cover are important. This is why we pay close attention to North Korea, a nuclear armed nation. This is why we pay close attention with what's happening in Iran, because we know Iran has been designated a state sponsor of terror, and the United States believes that Iran is trying to pursue nuclear weapons. The issue isn't just what countries have nuclear weapons. It's who could get their hands on nuclear weapons. So are they secure? Are they in an area where terrorist groups could access them? It doesn't take a lot of nuclear weapons to cause a lot of damage. It takes one. We know this from our history. So just having the awareness that this is a kind of a part of our news cycle, even if we don't acknowledge it on a regular basis. We're seeing it now. It's being brought to the forefront. And this is the reality of military and defense departments around the world. A note on that, we're getting a lot of background information from officials. For example, I just read a Department of Defense briefing of the press. Usually these briefings come across from a quote-unquote unnamed official. It's made known to the journalists that are on the call. The White House also does this, and then they release the transcript. So that's something that you can actually take a look at yourself. You could read it yourself. It's accessible to the public if you go to the Defense Department or the White House website and access it. The Defense Department was asked about this specifically. Well, what about this? I mean, this is scary. Even the thought of this is scary. We didn't think, maybe even going into last week, that we would see innocent people killed, children killed in Ukraine by Russia. We knew that maybe it was a possibility, but the reality of it is so different. So this idea of a nuclear conflict is just, it's very scary. The Pentagon was asked about this directly, and they said that they don't speak about our nation's deterrence. But it's something that I'm going to be looking at more closely if we hear from the Pentagon on the record today, because that is something that the American public will want to hear about as well as the rest of the world. Now, there's, again, going back to sort of the hypothetics, people are asked to handicap. Well, what are the chances of that? I don't think anyone really knows right now. Based on my reading and my reporting, I don't know if anyone really knows right now. And that's scary to admit, but we have to be clear-eyed about what's going on. So that's number one. Number two, what is the one thing to know about this conflict that's happening in Ukraine? I think it's this. Let me go ahead and show you the map. This is a map that is being used by the BBC, thanks to them. They're paying really close attention to where Russian forces are. So you can see that red representing Russian forces. You see the city of Kyiv. Now, just a note on that, some of you have asked, why is it Kyiv or Kiev? Why are we hearing different things? In the course of my career, I've actually used different pronunciations, and probably both of them are wrong with my American accent. But we're using Kyiv because that is our understanding of the way the Ukrainians refer to their capital city. Kiev is the Russian pronunciation, so that's why we're continuing to use that. I'm mentioning that because I've never actually said the name of Kharkiv, or Kharkev actually is the correct pronouncer according to my research. Kharkev, probably wrong still. But Kharkiv is that city that's just to the right of Kyiv. That is the second largest city in Ukraine. It has the population the size of about comparable to San Diego or San Antonio, about 1.4, 1.5 million people. This is the city that obviously is very close to where Russian forces have been on the border, but also is a city with really strong ties to Russia. So why am I showing you this map? One of the most important things to know over the last couple of days is this clear fact. At this time, no Ukrainian cities have fallen to Russian forces. Let me repeat that. no Ukrainian cities have fallen to Russian forces. That is almost unbelievable where we were last week, considering the amount of resources Russia has, the size of their military, the sort of invasion we thought that they had planned and they had set up for months. Remember, they're setting up their forces along the Ukrainian border, not just over the last several weeks, but over the last year. They've been there. So I'm paying close attention to this city, though, the second largest city, because according to reports, and again, as I jumped on just to talk to you today, I have yet to see the specifics. I think we'll be able to see later today of an increased aggression in this particular city, of Russian forces using some different tools of warfare to attack civilian positions. This is all according to reports. Senator Marco Rubio, who speaks out very frequently, is on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said that what we will see out of this particular city as the world gets light of what happened there today, it will change the way that we're thinking of this conflict. This is what he said. We'll see. We'll wait and see. But we're going to be watching to see if Ukraine can hold on to their cities. If they can hold on to their cities, that's a really big repellent against Russian forces that have clearly outmatched them in many ways, but that hasn't had the smooth path to just taking over cities in Ukraine as previously thought. And these aren't just the big cities. These are also smaller cities. So this is one thing to be aware of today. And this is what I would say is the one major thing to watch. There's so much to watch in the world. We're going to watch the security of these cities. We're going to watch to see if the Ukrainians can keep control of these cities. And we'll see what reports actually come out of there. So I think that's really important. If you're waking up in Russia today, let's say you're just an average Russian citizen, maybe you don't even really have strong political beliefs. You know, the value of your currency is falling very quickly due to sanctions announced this weekend. Perhaps you had a trip planned with your family to Europe. You were going to bring your kids to Rome, to the museums, let's just say. You were going to use a Russian airline. Your airlines have been banned from Europe. So the isolation of Russia is happening. The pressure is being put on Russia from Europe and the United States, not only financially, but also practically. And the effect of that and what that actually means for the Russian economy is something that we're going to also equally watch. The reason why this particular city is also important to keep an eye on is because it also illuminates for us how close Russia and Ukraine is and how much crossover there is between the two. I mean, think about border cities in the United States. We can think about it in Texas, where you have half the family living in Texas. You have the other part of the family living in Mexico, and you can drive back and forth. You know, some of your cousins live over here, some of your cousins live over there, but you see each other very often. And what's important about this city of Kharkiv as well is that it has a really high population of Russian nationals, of those that maybe would more closely align themselves with Russia than in a city like Kyiv, for example, because of location. Not only that, I mean, just not history, but also location. So now what Russia's doing is attacking very aggressively a city with some of its own nationals in it. And what that reminds me of is our interview with David Satter, the journalist that we talked to last week. I hope to have him back again this week. Because remember what he said about Vladimir Putin, according to his reporting, that Vladimir Putin didn't worry about hurting his own citizens in his rise to power. This is David's reporting. Some have challenged that, but that is David's reporting after 40 years in this part of the world. And so that calls to mind Vladimir Putin's calculations right now to double down on a city that may even have more sympathetic people to Russia. That's why it's significant. This is why, and that's also why it's significant that it's not under Russian control. Okay, final thing I want to tell you about before we get to some of your questions, and I'm going to go a little bit different direction. I don't think you're going to see anything like this on the news, and I think this is really, really important. So we got a kind of a big picture of what to know, and then this is the final thing. This is context. So in the summer, what were you doing in July, just after July 4th? You even remember, right? It seemed like a different world back then. It was a different world back then. Vladimir Putin published a 5,000-word essay about Ukraine and about the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. And it got a lot of attention. It was published, all over the Russian government website. I mean, think about that. Think about President Biden sitting down and all of a sudden releasing a 5,000-word essay on the relationship with Canada. It's like, okay. So what did what did Vladimir Putin have to say about this? I'm going to put a link to this also underneath this video on the website. It is a long read, and just a word of warning, there's a lot of history that Vladimir Putin goes through that is his interpretation of history that likely may not be matched by others. But what people say matters. And this is what Vladimir Putin said in July, ahead of all of this, but also understanding that forces were already in position in some places along the Ukrainian border. So let me read the first paragraph. Step by step, this is Vladimir Putin, step by step, Ukraine was dragged into a dangerous geopolitical game aimed at turning Ukraine into a barrier between Europe and Russia and a springboard against Russia. Inevitably, there came a time when the concept of Ukraine is not Russia was no longer an option. There was a need for the anti-Russia concept, which we will never accept. He goes on, I was asked about Russian-Ukrainian relations. I said that Russians and Ukrainians were one people, a single whole. And I would like to emphasize that the wall that has emerged in recent years between Russia and Ukraine is a great common misfortune and tragedy, and the results of deliberate efforts. So this is his building argument. I thought this was important. Again, long read. I'm just picking out a couple excerpts for you. Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, or Belarusians, you might hear them, both those that live in Belarus, are all descendants of the same country, of the largest state in Europe. And he goes back to say that the spiritual choice made by Saint Vladimir, who was the Grand Prince of Kiev, still largely determines our affinity today. So he's saying, listen, Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, we're all the same. We're actually one. We're of the same blood. He actually uses that term. We respect Ukrainians' desire to see their country free, safe, and prosperous. I am confident that true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia. This is what he said. This is what he said in July. Let's go on. Our kinship has been transmitted from generation to generation. It is the hearts and the memory of people living in modern Russia and Ukraine, in the blood ties that unite millions of our families. Together we have always been and will be many times stronger and more successful, for we are one people. So this is what Vladimir Putin is saying in July. He ends with this, I will say one thing, Russia has never been and will never be anti-Ukraine, and what Ukraine will be is up to its citizens to decide. He was saying basically there's this groundswell of anti-Russian sentiment in Ukraine that doesn't belong, that's not natural to this. And so this is the roadmap that he put out. Now you say to me, well, wait a minute, if they're all one people, Jenna, then how is he's bombing his own people? How does that, I can't square it for you. All I can tell you is the words that he read, that I'm reading, that he wrote, that are directly from Vladimir Putin, that he felt compelled enough this summer to put this in writing to explain his argument for a united part of Europe. And so one of you asked, and this is also interesting news today, Zane was confused about how Belarus fits into all of this. Now, let me see if the map, we can see Belarus more clearly. That's pretty good. You see Belarus to the north, you see Russia. So Belarus has a government in place that is closely tied to Russia. I mean, very, very close allies. And Ukraine obviously is part of this picture. I read one historian said that the very first history book on Russia was actually published in Ukraine in the 1600s. They were all one entity at the time. And so this historian's thinking was, and I'd love to reach out to him for an interview, is that a lot of how Russia defines itself has been defined by Ukraine in the past. And as Ukraine has been turning more Western, more pro-democracy, not there yet, by the way, still a lot of corruption, a lot to work through, that has been felt as a threat to Vladimir Putin, who doesn't want that sort of freedom in his own society because that would threaten his power. So Belarus fits into all of this because it's a partner with Russia. And something you should know today is that our Secretary of State actually closed our embassy in Minsk, which is the capital of Belarus. So we're moving out of there and apparently pulling back even more of our embassy personnel, anything that's left in Russia. That's definitely a sign of heightened aggression. So that's how Belarus fits into that. You also have Russian forces in Belarus. Belarus, of course, is right next to Poland, which is a NATO country. So this is where there's also concern. Now, right along the border between Belarus and Ukraine is something that we're watching closely today. Let me open my computer. I don't like to do this with you guys because I like to just focus on you, but I can't help it. I want to see if we have any information, because today we were waiting to see what would happen with this meeting between the Russian side and the Ukrainian side. It was supposed to be happening on the border of Belarus. And at last check, I didn't see any updates. It's just apparently continuing. We're seeing some more updates from the UN, from different parts of the world, but not seeing anything specifically as to this meeting. The one update that I did get before I jumped on with you, and I thought this was important, was that the French president actually reached out to Vladimir Putin. And apparently, according to one report, they spoke for about 90 minutes. So diplomacy in some respects is happening. The French president has been in the forefront of that, has traveled to Russia in the past, and has engaged Vladimir Putin. So I don't like to put things in categories of good news or bad news. We don't really know how the news is going to develop. But the fact is that there's someone communicating with Vladimir Putin, and that can't be said for a lot of different countries in the world right now. So that's important to pay attention to. Apparently, according to these reports, Vladimir Putin still has the same demands, which is that Ukraine doesn't join NATO, repeating this idea of the denazification of Ukraine, of getting people out of Ukraine that are anti-Russian or that are threatening Russian nationals inside Ukraine. He hasn't let go of that. But the fact that there is some dialogue is important, I think is important to note. Is there any questions I can answer for you guys? This before I go for today. This is usually longer than what we normally do together, but I think this is a good time for us just to kind of hang out for a moment and see what we can kind of work through. There's so many different changing parts of this story. One of the key parts of the story was Germany over the weekend. And there was a lot of news over this weekend. Germany in the past, one of the big conflicts with NATO, and this is something that President Trump talked a lot about. We're not going to get into the controversy over this, but the issue with NATO, regardless of who the American president is, has been whether or not NATO nations are actually investing what they should in their defenses. Remember, this is a collective alliance. We're supposed to invest a certain amount in our defenses so that we can watch out for each other. And there's been a feeling amongst some, not all American politicians, but some, that Europe has sort of sat back and said, well, we have America's backing. They spend a lot in their defenses. So we're good. And if you can actually see, there's supposed to be this promise of how much we're investing, and there's some reporting of that. And so there's been a question about whether or not these European nations are actually doing that. And Germany's new chancellor actually this weekend came out and said that Germany is going to redouble its efforts to invest in its own defense, and it's actually sending equipment to Ukraine. That's a really big deal, because remember, Germany really depends on Russian oil resources, energy resources, but also Germany hasn't necessarily wanted to be a leader when it comes to defense. That hasn't been something that's been necessarily valued. And so that's a big change, and that's something to be notable. Interesting. Jenny Lee was asking the Ukraine president petitioning the EU, how can they help if Ukraine is not actually part of the EU? That's an interesting part of this to watch. So there's been all this conversation about Ukraine joining NATO or not joining NATO. And one of the reasons why Ukraine hasn't joined NATO or hasn't been part of that process yet has also been the question about who's in leadership in Ukraine. Just overarching the government system. Is the government system free of corruption? Does Ukraine really want to stand for democracy? This is a young nation emerging from a time when their leadership was totally connected and tethered to Russia. So there's been some uncertainty about what is the exact direction of this country and whether or not Ukraine shares the same values as the rest of the members of NATO. Some of these questions are asked of NATO countries regularly, like Turkey, for example. And there's been a question about, well, is everyone in NATO? Are we the same? Do we share the same values? So this is part of the reason why Ukraine hasn't been a member of NATO in the past, at least so far. The question of joining the European Union is a separate one. And I actually had the same question, Jenny, today about, what would that take with the European Union to have Ukraine as a member? How would Vladimir Putin perceive that? Let's say Ukraine promises not to become a member of NATO, takes that completely off the table, but says, I want to be a member of the EU. How would that change or shift? I'm not sure. Remember, Vladimir Putin in the past has not only been negative about NATO, the NATO alliance, but the European Union in general. And there's been reports that he enjoys the conflict that you see between EU nations because it shows like they're not really that united, and it's more beneficial to him to have a more divided Europe next to him rather than a strong, united Europe that has a group of people with different values than what he would like to see in Russia. Anything new on China's response? Excellent question, Gina. That is a huge question today. A couple weeks ago, Chinese president and the Russian president have a meeting. They basically promised this sort of undefined but very, I don't want to say over the top, but it was very much like we're going to be together. Like we're going to support each other no matter what. The question for China right now is the no matter what. How many nations do want to support what Russia's doing in Ukraine now that they see it and now that the world sees it and they're having to deal with their own public? So what's going to be interesting to watch, China over the last couple of days said that they were going to open, we talked a little bit about this last week, open up their marketplace to Russian wheat. A big export for Russia. So you have a huge market that China could help Russia. What is China's calculation going into this week? Every leader has to answer to their own people. So there are some leaders that want to maintain some neutrality on this. They don't want to get involved. There are some that are aggressively speaking out against Russia. And we're going to be watching China very, very closely. Is China enough of a partner that if Russia's cut off of all this, this huge global financial system, SWIFT that we've talked about, heavily sanctioned by Europe and the United States, if the oligarchs, these really wealthy people that are having their yachts taken, for example, you laugh at it, but this is part of the pressure that the Western world is trying to put on Vladimir Putin. Is there enough room with China and other countries to give Russia enough flexibility to get around some of those sanctions? I think that's a really interesting question. China is a huge economy. It depends on how many of these oligarchs want their yachts in the South China Sea versus off of Positano. That's one of the questions. It sounds ridiculous, but this is what the Western world is trying to do: isolate, pressure, so that Putin starts to make different calculations. The question is, do we have the leverage to do that? And China is really key to that. So we'll be asking some more questions about that today. Any other questions I can get? Sarah, I'm so overwhelmed trying to explain this to my teens. I feel I have more questions than answers. Welcome to the world. I don't think you're alone in that. And I don't think you should feel like that you don't have the right answer. I don't think anyone really has the answers right now. That's why I actually think what's a really good exercise and something that I try to do is shut down the computer, step back and say, well, what are the major themes? Especially when I'm speaking to my kids and they're really young. A lot of our major stories, my mom used to say, there's no new stories, there's only new people, and in a lot of ways that's true. There's war and peace, there's good and bad. And a lot of trying to put this story in those categories is a good exercise to try to say, Ukraine wants to be an independent nation. Russia doesn't want that. So Russia is attacking Ukraine. And this is where people are being hurt by this. My 7-year-old asked me as he went to bed last night, Mom, is Russia going to attack the United States? And I said, I have to be honest with you. The reality is that we can't anticipate the threats. There are bad people in the world. And it may not be Russia, it could be somebody else. I said, you're very lucky and blessed to live in a strong nation. And your job is to continue to make sure that America remains a strong nation. You're in a strong, smart country. And that, I know sometimes we don't talk to each other that way. It's more easy to talk about amongst division. But that's the reality of America. And we talked a lot about, he was asking me about freedom and what does freedom mean? These are big questions. And you know what? I have to say, one of the things I've learned as a journalist is that people don't wind up in a storyline just randomly. Believe what you want to believe about the world, but I actually believe that we're being forced. Think about the stories that we've had to confront over the last several years. We are being forced to define, what does America look like in the world? What does freedom really mean? What does personal liberty mean to me? When I define personal liberty, what does that mean? I've talked about it all my life. Like, what does that actually mean? We're being forced, not your parent, like us, you and me, we're being forced to examine these large themes. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think we're being asked to really dig deeper on these topics. And fundamentally, when you look at a lot of these stories, including, let's say, the American president's address tomorrow night for the State of the Union, we're going to be asking to define America, identify America. What does America mean in the world? Who are we? These are tough questions. They're not easy. But that's why we have to kind of work through it together. So that's where we are at today. I'm going to continue to work throughout the day and try to jump in with notable moments. There's a lot of news sources out there that are continuing to recycle, a lot of viral video. Listen, I love them. I'm very grateful. I want to see the video too. I really appreciate all the hard work that's actually being done around the world to try to keep everyone informed, because the clearer-eyed we are about this story, the better, because then we can have the most authentic reaction, the truest reaction, live in the true moment. That's what we want. Truth is difficult, right? Who defines it can be difficult. That's like a whole philosophical conversation I'm totally not ready for on a Monday morning. But that's why, I appreciate that. I appreciate all of this sharing. But I view our job at Smarter News is what to know, why it matters, what to know, why it matters. So I'm going to jump on with, okay, this is something to know. This is why it matters. That's why I jumped on this weekend for a couple different things. So I also want to answer your questions. So keep those coming. That's a great question by Abby. Will Vladimir Putin and President Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, meet? We have no signs of that yet. We don't know if that's a possibility. Last week at this time, we still thought it was a possibility that President Biden and President Putin can meet. That was taken off the table, I believe, on Tuesday of last week. So it's a reminder that things can change quickly. They can go, because it's spiral downward, but they can also spiral upward. And we don't want to forget that. Jay Witt's asking, how do you buy a badge? Thank you very much. On Instagram, they allow you, when you're doing a live, to actually, it's at the bottom of your screen, you're able to like hit a little heart shape, and allows you to basically send a tip, like a contribution to Smarter News, something that we've been trying out. You all have been so generous with that with our lives, and I really appreciate it. I mean, we're really focused on bringing you high quality, small bites of information. I have a small team. I've spent my savings building this company, and I see big things ahead. And your support means so much. I mean, we can't do it without you. Fundamentally, the biggest support is sharing Smarter News, because something that we've talked about for building a business, and it's true for countries too. The power is in the people. The power is in the people. The people speak. When the people speak, everybody listens. And this is what we're watching in Ukraine. We're watching Ukrainians try to speak for themselves, and the power of the people that are not fully armed, that don't have this massive military, actually repel a world power. I mean, that's remarkable what we're seeing. So that's why we're going to pay close attention again. What are we watching today? We're going to watch these key Ukrainian cities. We're going to see, can they hang on? Can they hang on? What now? If one of them falls, does that mean all of Ukraine falls? I'm not sure that's what it means. Could I see some sort of negotiation in the future where some of these cities or some of these contested areas that have been contested for a really long time? I'll just go back to the map real quick here. Especially these areas to the east. You're seeing kind of by Mariupol down there. These areas that have been these separatist controlled areas, could they be carved out? And can Russia annex them? Could we see that? Potentially. We don't really know what could be on the table as far as negotiations go. Okay, quick. Let me just do one more check to see about any other questions I can grab before we leave. And if not, then I'm going to go in and answer some of them in Instagram stories. I think that's a great way to keep up. Although I don't know about you guys, I get sometimes overwhelmed when I see like 1,000 Instagram stories across the top. What do you do? Yeah, it's, but hopefully it's a good way to keep us close together. So working a little bit on a background of the State of the Union. It's an interesting American tradition, something that we're really going to watch for. I'm going to be paying close. Remember, it's a live televised event. 9 p.m. Eastern time is going to be 4 o'clock in the morning in Ukraine. You have to remember these time differences too, because here we are in the middle of the day in America, and a lot of the footage you may be seeing looks middle of the day in Ukraine when it's already nightfall, and that this is where we're getting a lot of recycled footage, and it can give us an image of things that maybe not 100% correct. So we're going to be watching for any images out of Kharkiv. That's the city that we're going to be paying close attention to, along with Kyiv. And we will keep you posted with any more information. I use your questions as a way to help push us editorially to answer what you need. Sort of like Choose Your Own Adventure books. I love those books. I love those. What happened to those? Do you sort of feel like you're in one of those right now? I do. Like, let's pick one. Which path could it go? Like, then you wind up like, down an alley somewhere. I feel like this is sort of what we're in. But please continue to direct message us any questions. I use them. I listen to you. I respond to a lot of you. And it's me responding. This is it. What you see is what you get. So thank you so much, everybody, for your support of Smarter News. Thanks for being here today. A little bit longer on a Monday morning, but I think we needed it. And we'll have more on all these developing stories. I'll leave you with this. The former ambassador to Russia, Ambassador Michael McFaul, he's actually a professor now. He was saying that this moment that we're in, this is how you would assess it. I just want to leave you this, is not only a fight for the future of freedom, but a fight for the international system. That's the fight we're in right now. So those are the stakes as he sees it. A lot of people see the stakes differently, but I thought that was an interesting quote. So I didn't even touch on any of the COVID policies. Expect maybe that later in the week. But we got a lot of movement in that direction, and I have more on those stories on smarternews.com, including this new tool that the CDC released late on Friday that is supposed to be a way for you to understand the risk in your area and assess guidelines that you could potentially follow. It's new. It's linked directly on our website. A lot of news came out late Friday over the weekend. Remember, it's not just the State of the Union that's happening tomorrow, but we're about 9 months away from the midterm elections. And now things are going to start moving after the State of the Union to the direction. Yeah, we're here already. So not saying that's the only calculation, but it's definitely a factor in a lot of the things that we're seeing, and we need to be wide-eyed about that. All right, guys, have a great day. Thanks again for all your support of Smarter News, and more information on all of this on smarternews.com. Have a great day. I'll see you soon.